I'm really excited about artificial intelligence if it's virtuously developed and virtuously implemented. By that, I mean that for the most part, it needs to be open sourced. And I see it as one of the great hopes for protecting sovereignty.
All right, Kevin, thanks for talking to me.
Man, what a pleasure. I just met you. I knew, it seems like a lot about you, and it's a real pleasure. Hopefully we didn't take too much time or too much of your thunder backstage because we already hit it off.
I already asked all my questions, just going to rehearse them. First question, since you're a historian, I want to ask you a little bit about history first. There seems to be a centuries-long trend where our political leaders seem to get less and less impressive over time. So whatever you think of Trump and Biden, they're not exactly Jefferson and Madison. Does this matter? And if it does, why has this been happening?
Boy, great question. I'm going to avoid talking about specific leaders because when I do that, especially this summer, it gets misinterpreted as being an endorsement of one or the other, which I can't do. But I'm not going to evade the question, which I don't do. And so I will say two things. First of all, I generally agree with your premise that over time, leaders become less impressive. And you think about American leaders, I'll posit that there are exceptions, and I think on both sides, but I also think about European leaders. I think about leaders around the world. And so I think the reason for that is that they share something that most Americans share, which is that in spite of the great advances we've made in scientific and engineering and mathematic understanding, we really are a lot less read. Now, I'm a liberal arts guy. I've run 2 great book schools, and so maybe I'm particularly sensitive to that. But the second thing I would say is a slight difference of opinion, and that is having just finished Ron Chernow's great biography of Alexander Hamilton. I told my wife, I just finished it before I came out here. It's written about 15 years ago, I guess. I said, Michelle, my wife, I said, Michelle, these guys were at each other's throats as much as any of our political leaders today. And she said, that's impossible. But they were. I mean, John Adams, for all of his virtue and service to this country, was irascible and mean. Alexander Hamilton had, his downsides. Jefferson's are rather public. The point is, we all suffer from the human condition, and I would conclude with this point, Dwarkesh, because I keep going on. You asked an early American historian this question, I might filibuster, that our leaders reflect us. And perhaps what we do more than anything at Heritage is try to give our policymakers, whether they're on the left or the right or the center, federal, state, local level, the intellectual tools to make better decisions. And maybe that's where we need to focus our time.
That sounds like a good idea. I'm not sure how you get a Jefferson out of giving people a briefing. Or when are we going to get the next really smart president?
I mean the following. I'll single out someone because it's a compliment. Senator Mike Lee, I would say, is equal or almost equal to Jefferson. I think that there are governors, maybe some members of the U.S. House who are. I think that Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, to cite a non-American, has certainly got the verve of Jefferson. They're probably kindred spirits. So in other words, I don't disagree with the premise on the whole. I guess I can see some exceptions to that premise that give me a little bit of hope.
If you could make one change to the Constitution, if you could go back to the framers and tell them, you guys got to fix this.
I'm in the 1780s or I'm in 2024?
1780s.
So I'm in the 1780s, but I don't understand, because I'm in the 1780s, all of the moral limitations in the Constitution.
What do you mean?
I am a bald, white conservative. And so if I don't acknowledge, even though I am a historian of slavery, okay, just letting you know what life is like.
Yeah.
I usually start conversations by saying, I'm Kevin Roberts from Project 2025, and I'm here to help. That's the context for that. I'm being somewhat silly, although serious, as a historian of slavery. So I'm in the 1780s, and you want me to change something in the Constitution?
So obviously slavery, but that was maybe something that wasn't amended later, something that still bugs us today.
I would provide greater clarity on 2 things. One, which has become a thorn in our side, not just because it's expensive, and that is how much the federal government can spend. Sometimes conservatives, including we at Heritage, will attack that by saying, and I'll get back to the 1780s, I promise, will attack that by saying, oh, get rid of the amendment that created the income tax. The issue isn't the income tax per se. The issue is federal spending, which when combined with a lack of political courage by both sides leads to a bloat in the federal government which undermines individual sovereignty. So I would provide greater clarity there if I could bring something from the future. But the second is I would provide greater clarity on state power. Notice I didn't say states' rights because that's fraught with some misunderstandings. State power. For example, Heritage, regardless of what happens with this presidential election, will be working extensively on something known as interstate compacts. It's a revitalization of federalism. So if you have someone on the political right who wants to use the federal government too much, or you have someone on the left who wants to use the federal government too much, then an interstate compact is a very good vehicle to do that, but it's been largely untested, even almost 250 years into our history. So I would suggest respectfully to the founders that they say more about that.
On the first point about the spending, is it that they're not allowed to have deficits? How do you actually control?
That's what I would say.
Okay.
So, we're proponents at Heritage of a balanced budget all the time, the Balanced Budget Amendment. I'm a signatory to the Convention of States Project, which argues for this. And what I like about that, beyond the obvious, I think most of us agree the federal government spends money it doesn't have, is that it also transcends, for the most part, the ideological partisan battles in this country.
Your doctorate was on slaves and slavery in Louisiana. How does your scholarship in the history of slavery inform your worldview today and the things you do today?
It sometimes surprises people that the president of the Heritage Foundation is, I won't use the word expert to define myself, but a specialist in early African-American history. And the reason for that is growing up on the Gulf Coast in Louisiana, I was fascinated by the interaction, sometimes the collision of white and African-American cultures. And so as I got into being a professional historian, I wanted to get to the basis of that, which I did in my academic work. But I'm really grateful that I did that and grateful for the training that I got from, professors who mostly disagree with me politically. They were great formators of me as a historian, because my application of that to the work that I do now, more than anything, drives me to the evidence. And so you just saw my wonderful colleague and friend, Kara Frederick, on the stage. Kara, of course, is a great messenger, but at the core of Kara's great work, the core of the work that we do at Heritage, even if someone might disagree with one of our policy positions, is that we're going to start with the evidence first. And when you're a historian, particularly a social historian, as I was trained, although you always have your biases, you want to go to the evidence, as I was trained, and let the evidence tell you the story. And so that's something that I use probably more times in a day than I really realize consciously.
All right, let's talk a little bit about tech, which I imagine the audience is interested in.
I imagine that's an interest.
Why aren't you more positive on big tech? They're like the greatest institutions in the country that produce all this innovation, all this surplus. A lot of small businesses like mine would not be possible without big tech. Shouldn't we celebrate them more?
They're not the greatest institutions in this country. The greatest institution in this country is the nuclear family. Now, I was just about to say, I don't mean to be argumentative, but that would have been dishonest. I fully meant to be argumentative, Dwarkesh, but with a smile on my face, my friend. Look, but to the heart of your question, because I do want to be intellectually honest with this, although I agree with I believe what I just said. I believe as a conservative that too many people in big tech have their priorities misordered. And the success of a lot of the innovations, not all, a lot of the innovations in big tech, not taking away from the hard work that many people have put into it, comes at the expense of Americans. And for those of us who are conservative, libertarians, I'm a civil libertarian and a social conservative, I get really concerned about my privacy rights, which as I sit here are no doubt being violated. But I mean, I can tell you with certainty they're being violated because of collusion between big tech and big government. I will put an end to that crap.
And how would you do that?
I would use antitrust law to end Google's monopoly over our speech, particularly our political speech. If you're a Republican member of the U.S. House of Representatives and you send out a fundraising email in the last cycle, 2022, you're 99 times more likely to have that censored than if you're on the left.
One thing I wonder about is if you give the antitrust authorities more power to enforce action against big tech, One of the points you often made is that all the people at the DOJ, FTC are very left-wing. And the rational response of big tech when the regulators have more power would be to, let's make sure they're appeased, they're happy with us. How do we do that? Well, if Biden tells us we got to censor something on social media, we should pay attention. And that probably was a motivation behind Zuckerberg and others deciding to do that as they revealed. So if you are concerned about that, shouldn't you want to make sure that the left-wing bureaucrats have less power?
Yes, and I appreciate the question. Truly, the action that I'm proposing on Google, and I'm singling them out in particular for a reason, doesn't happen in a vacuum. To I think the underlying point of your question, it happens in conjunction with another thing that you allude to at the end of your follow-up question, which is that at Heritage, a little bit of ink has been written in the last 10 weeks on our desires to dismantle the administrative state and to bring to an end the imposition of leftist ideology by bureaucrats against Americans. And they are doing this in collusion with big tech. There is the fear, to be intellectually honest, that there could be a conservative administration who goes too far in saying, well, we've done this with Google, let's do it with companies X, Y, and Z. I think it's very important to have a limiting principle on that and really focus on what I see to be the sort of social secular sins that Google in particular has committed.
I guess I don't see the logical connection between antitrust and making these institutions left-wing. So if you break up Google and it's 10 smaller companies, to the extent the employees have left-wing bias, they'll still be left-wing. To the extent that people will still choose to use these products despite the fact that they have a left-wing bias, maybe that's a consumer preference. That'll still continue to exist.
Fair, but there's a behavior we're trying to change, which is just to start with the example that I cited. If you decide that it's too late now in the 2024 cycle, in the 2026 cycle, that you're going to run as a Republican for the U.S. House, if history is a guide, and this historian will tell you that it is, then your fundraising emails will be 99 times more likely to be censored, to go into junk mail because of Google. Let's focus on that and fix that. Now, you may say, Kevin, come on, if you break up Google and you have 10 companies doing this, it's just as bad. But there is a certain deterrent effect that kind of government action has. Now, you're more libertarian-minded, which you know that I respect. I'm more of a conservative, which means I'm a little more willing to use the federal government's power on a limited basis for the common good. I'm telling you that this example and many others, including huge concerns that at Heritage we have about privacy, I think rise to that level of using the government for that.
What are future technologies that you are excited about, which will help bring about the conservative vision for America you have? Or does technology always, is there like a right-wing version of the pill, or does it always tilt left?
The right-wing version of the pill from this Roman Catholic is more families and kids.
But what technology?
I wasn't trying to evade your question, my friend. I appreciate your question. It's thought-provoking. I will tell you, I was wrong about something as a conservative. I was wrong wrong. I'm not trying to qualify that. I was really short-sighted in particular about how conservatives could embrace technology for not partisan politics or even ideology, but sort of the philosophical worldview we have. And since I've been the president at Heritage, and honestly, not being gratuitous here, having met people like you and several in the audience, my thinking has changed. And it's made me realize that rather than be the kind of dinosaurs that the left characterizes us to be, and my kids tell me I am sometimes, that we really ought to think about how, for the sake of the common good, to lean on this claim that I just made in the previous exchange, conservatives and those of you in tech can not just work together, but we really are kindred spirits. And so while the specific thing that I think I was wrong about, even in a debate 2.5 years ago, I said, I don't ever have to worry about AI. And the guy just laughed at me, as he should have. I meant that, but I realized, that was a little short-sighted and kind of dumb, Kevin. And so I'm really excited about artificial intelligence if it's virtuously developed and virtuously implemented. By that, I mean that for the most part, it needs to be open sourced. And I see it as one of the great hopes for protecting sovereignty. Your sovereignty to be a libertarian, my sovereignty to be a conservative, someone else's sovereignty to be a liberal, but far more important than our sort of ideological dispositions, our sovereignty to be human beings. Because, in other words, and I'll go on, but I'll wrap up here in the interest of time. In other words, those of us who are conservatives in the United States care very deeply about institutions. We care very deeply about freedom and low taxes and all of those things. But ultimately, what motivates us is human flourishing. And in order to have human flourishing, we have to be self-governing. And I now realize that that particular technology and others can actually lead us to that.
Speaking of AI, if you really believe that in your lifetime or in your kid's lifetime, there's not going to be just human level intelligence, but like a superhuman intelligence, like a little god or something. What is your reaction to that possibility? Separate from maybe the immediate concern about China or the political censorship on it. Just zooming out, how do you think about this event in human history?
Well, my gut reaction is it scares the hell out of me. So I turn the question around on you so I can do a better job of answering your question. Give me some symptoms, some examples of what the superintelligence looks like. Because I'm answering your question now, not as the president of Heritage, but as a dad, as someone who mentors a lot of young people, and it just scares the daylights out of me.
I don't know how crazy you want to get here, but...
I'm inviting you. I'm not being evasive here. I'm really trying to answer your question.
Sure. Like 20% economic growth a year, expanding through space. And then on Tuesday, we'll look at some more stuff.
Okay. Those both sound great to me. I guess where my mind went, and perhaps this is telling for those of you who aren't political conservatives, which, by the way, is totally fine, getting some insight into the minds of American conservatives to the extent I represent some of them, where my mind went was like transhumanism. Mm-hmm. And things that violate the dignity of the human person. And so I mentioned in the previous response I was wrong about something. The thing that I think we're all right about is one of our guiding principles, one of our guiding questions ought to be about technology, about this superhuman intelligence is, does this elevate, does it at least protect, defend the dignity of the human person? Every single human person, from Kamala Harris to Donald Trump, every single human person. And if it does, then we can get to the second order questions about regulation and so on.
A moment ago you said that, somebody who's a conservative should get their conservative AI, somebody who's a libertarian should get their libertarian AI. Shouldn't the transhumanists get their transhumanist AI and get to upgrade themselves?
Hell no.
Why not? I want the Jupiter brains.
You want me to answer that seriously?
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's fine. Because it violates the dignity of the human person.
Right,
look, I can cite religious tracts, which I know is not going to be popular with everybody. I can lean on natural law, which I think if we're intellectually honest, we might do. But anything that violates nature, conservatives, for what it's worth, if they're being intellectually honest, are going to stand against that. And not just because it's like some rigid adherence we have to a principle, although sometimes we're that way. It's also, most importantly, about the common good and about human flourishing. And so where I would respectfully attack that position is that it violates that.
This might be a longer conversation, so I'll move on to, should we be stapling a green card to every single STEM degree that's earned in the United States?
I agree with the motivation, but ultimately the answer is no for now. Heritage is a big proponent of huge immigration reform, such that we place an emphasis on what I think is the underlying premise of your question, which is more merit-based immigration, very selective, very generous, by the way, dare I say, even liberal. I mean, we're very pro-immigrant. I definitely am pro-immigrant. But the problem is when you just not only open the floodgates, but you also you're operating, the elites in Washington and other places, but particularly Washington, are operating with the thesis that wide open immigration with a lawless southern border, not just open, and I don't mean this as hyperbole, We don't do that at Heritage. I mean it when I say it. It's lawless. Visit it. That's on purpose. And it is to replace American workers. That until and unless we fix that, I don't think that we can have the political and policy conversation that's necessary to implement something like what you described. So,
why are the two mutually exclusive?
Well, for two reasons. The first is, probably meets the eye, they're mutually exclusive because of the politics of the thing. You'll never get the right and the left and the center in Washington anytime in our lifetimes, I would argue, to agree to that, because there are so many other secondary issues involved there. But the second more important reason is, we would argue at Heritage, until you actually fix the system, and fixing the system in our estimation starts with closing the southern border, reopening it eventually as part of a broader immigration reform, it's not worth having the conversation because of the damage that's being done by the existing problem.
I worry about some sort of deadlock here where I imagine your opponents are saying until we fix the immigration system, we can't close the border. Maybe that's not their argument, but it doesn't seem like you're opposed to high-skilled immigration. You support it. It's probably your opponents support high-skilled immigration. If that is the thing everybody agrees on, and I'm not sure why it gets in the way of fixing the border.
Thank you.
I'm not sure why that can't be fixed first.
It's a very fair follow-up. I'm trying not to be pig-headed, I promise, even though maybe you think I am. Let me home in on one specific thing. The reason that that's not going to happen is because our policy opponents on this, mostly the political left, will say, and I'm just telling you from someone who works on the inside in D.C., so I hate to say, just trust me, but just experience tells me, Dwarkesh, that they will claim that, and they will go into the back room, and they'll handshake on the deal, and that if our side gives them that, which we largely don't disagree with, they're going to say, we're going to help you close the border, but it never happens. Which is why what we're doing, and we're very transparent about this at Heritage, since the ridiculous failed immigration reforms of the last 10 years, is starting with fixing the immediate problem. Just like if in one of your new businesses, one of your projects is hemorrhaging money, you need to go fix that before you tackle what may be in the long run an even more promising project. That's what we're saying. And yes, it isn't just Heritage, it's the entire political right in this country that is committed to that. And what the radical left needs to understand is negotiate with us on those terms. We will be intellectually honest. Heritage will do its part to bring the political right along to the extent we can, and then we can have a conversation about these more advanced reforms.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like they could accuse you of holding high-skilled immigration hostage to this other debate. So
Sure.
I'll give
I'm just letting you know, and here I'll ask you, I won't say just trust me, Dwarkesh, or trust me in the audience. I will say just go read the history of the last immigration reforms, the most recent earlier this year, which has been, I'll be really brief here, which is being billed as something that the former president killed. I can let you know the design of that bill was to sort of give a nod to those of us who want to close the southern border, but they would have allowed 5,000 illegal aliens per day into this country. That's the kind of reason that causes us at Heritage to say, we're not negotiating on those terms.
Let's talk about Project 2025.
Sure, it's my favorite topic.
What's your favorite part about the deep state? And I mean that question genuinely because look, America's the greatest country. America's the greatest country in the world, and if the deep state is running it, they must be doing something right.
You were pressing me on my logic a few minutes ago. Just Josh, you're great, by the way. It's because you went to the University of Texas.
That's right.
Just like I did. Loving the conversation. Look, there's nothing about the deep state that I like. I mean, really. But that's not even because Heritage put together this project, which I imagine you have some questions about. It's because it's gotten to be too large, too expensive. But most importantly, more important than those two things, too untethered from the will of the people. And so if you forced me to say, Kevin, say something you like about the deep state, I would say, well, I'd like to insist that I'm just talking about the executive branch. And I would say, I do know that there are thousands of good men and women who report to work each day as bureaucrats and they try to do a really good job objectively, not having politics be part of their work. And one of the things I dislike about the deep state is that the ideologically driven leaders of some parts of the deep state actually undermine the dignity of their work. So I would like to restore, the whole purpose of Project 2025, by the way, is sort of to restore order, not just constitutional order, but just kind of regular order inside these offices.
It does make sense that there should be, if an organization can't fire people, it can't be an effective organization. How do you solve the other side of that equation, which is hiring the best and the brightest into government and making sure you can retain them?
Yeah, it's vital. I mean, in probably almost every part of government, not every part of government, almost every part of government, particularly in the sciences and medical arenas, it's important we have people with professional competence. Interestingly, ironically, the motivation of Project 2025 is to make that more possible. Because what's happened since the left has focused on the executive branch as the place where they can exercise their power continually, regardless of the outcome of legislative elections, is that the policy making of the executive branch has become far more ideological, and by that, on the left. But secondly, it's also become, and this is a constitutional crisis, we argue at Heritage, it's become untethered from Congress's appropriate oversight of the executive branch. That's a problem for both the left and the right and the center. Why has that happened? Because too many members of Congress have given that authority to the executive branch. And so, in a lot of ways, and not so much like defending Project 2025, although I'm happy to do that, as much as the long-standing desires of those of us on the American right, it's just to restore that proper order so that people who are competent in really key positions can do their jobs without politics interfering.
Mm. So as a libertarian type person, and I imagine many in tech and the audience are this way, I appreciate the pro-growth, pro-reform, pro-energy parts of the platform, but the culture war stuff, the deportation, abortion restrictions, all that in Project 25 concerns me. What do you got to say to people like me?
Yeah, great question. Well, a couple things. The first is that the Project 2025, the Mandate for Leadership book, that's really what we're talking about in this question, is something we've done since 1980. It's a menu of policy options. And I don't think I've encountered a single person in America who agrees with 100% of those policy options. It's like the menu at Cheesecake Factory. I've been there a few times. My wife refuses to go because she says, Kevin, I have a hard time in the drive-thru at McDonald's making a decision, in 30 seconds. I can't make a decision there. It's just huge. You get the point. But the second is the Reagan principle. Reagan said that 80% friends are not 20% enemies. So if you and libertarian friends and friends in this audience agree on the pro-growth, the deregulation, maybe working together more closely on AI, as some of us kind of stodgy conservatives have realized the short-sightedness that we've had, then let's go work on those things. And those other things that some of us happen to care about, I care about socially conservative things, let the best ideas win. But the key thing is, and I think this is the real lesson to draw from the discourse from leftist outlets on Project 2025, is that we don't have to hate one another in the process. Doesn't mean that we have to be the best of friends, although I'm willing to do that with anyone in this room. But it does mean that we really ought to be able to, when we do disagree, to do so civilly. It's just that a few on the radical left don't want that to happen. And admittedly, there are people on the right who don't want that to happen either. I'm letting you know at Heritage since 1980, when we first started this project for Ronald Reagan, that's one of the social benefits that can happen if we can get it implemented.
With hindsight, how would you have rolled out the project or the document in a way that didn't become like the main talking point of the Democrats in this election cycle?
Yeah, as you might imagine, I've thought a lot about that this summer. And, part of me, the adopted Texan in me says, well, I wouldn't change a damn thing. But that's not good leadership, right? And while there isn't anything we would change about the policies reflect where the conservative movement is. And keep in mind the rollout, as it were, I am going to get to a self-criticism here. The rollout, as it were, began 2 years ago. I mean, this book has been out for 2 years, or almost 2 years, 18 months for sure. And it's been on the web for 18 months. What made it controversial was that the political right has never been this organized. And we took a tactical page from the playbook of the left and said, the left has done, to their credit, a very good job of credentialing people to go into government. The left has done a very good job of elevating some of these government jobs to be things that people aspire to, and that's fine. But on the right, we've sort of demonized those things. And so let's change our thinking and also do so a little bit earlier than we usually do. And let's insert a policy conversation into the election cycle. I think we've succeeded in that. But the thing that I would change is, and this is the mistake that we made, is that in March, April, when we got an indication that the left was going to start demonizing the project, and some of us who were associated with it, we didn't necessarily go quiet, but we didn't respond in kind. And that's mostly because of how think tanks operate. We really are academics at our core. At Heritage, we're just as academic as any other think tank, but we also exist to help enact good policy. And so we're a little more oriented toward the advocacy of these things. We should have thought about the extent, the scale, the scope of the demonization by the left of what we were doing and responded in kind. They've probably spent, 3, 4, 5 times demonizing the project and frankly mischaracterizing it. I mean, just objectively, than we have on the project. We've gotten 50 fact checks from mostly left of center media outlets about claims that have been made about it. So our point is, you can disagree with some or maybe most of what's in there, but the intention was to bring some more substance to our discourse. We should have fought back harder, and so next time in 2028, if the left is in power, then what we're going to do is have a press conference just outside the White House and announce Project 2028.
And suppose you do get, Trump does get into power in 2025. I know you'll say it's not a partisan document, but
it really isn't. It's ideologically conservative, but it is definitely not tied to a particular person.
But now he has distanced himself from Project 2025, and obviously the antibodies and the media, deep state, whatever, have been activated. So what is the plan going forward? Is it somehow going to be resuscitated, depending on who the candidate is?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Look, if Vice President Harris and Governor Walz win, then there are a few elements of the Mandate for Leadership, the policy book that's part of this, that we might be able to work on, particularly if conservatives have a majority in the House and Senate. Who knows? I mean, maybe even immigration. Obviously, it's more likely if Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance win, and though Mr. Trump has distance himself from the brand Project 2025, I would fully anticipate, without being presumptuous, that's not how we operate, that great ideas and great people rise to the top. And there's a lot of policy overlap, as you may have noticed, between what we call for in the project, Mr. Trump's Agenda 47, which is a political document, and the RNC platform. I look forward to the day, as it was when I was growing up in the Deep South, when voters had a real choice between the two parties. Whether they were center left or center right, most of the big questions were differences on the margins. And so the motivation of the project is to restore that. But without being presumptuous, without feeling entitled, which we don't do at Heritage, I would anticipate that if Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance win, that conservatives on the whole will be very happy with their policy agenda.
If they win and suppose they're able to staff the administrative state, to the extent that I think you've pointed that out so often, is that a lot of the administrative state is full of people who often vote for Democrats or give to Democrats. Is this because there's a human capital problem in right-wing policymaking, that maybe there aren't as many people who are trying to instigate right-wing policy? And if so, how do you actually get the thousands of civil servants and think tankers and so forth?
Yeah, I think resoundingly so. And by saying that, I don't mean that the efforts to close that gap in the human capital problem are bad. It's just that they've not been sufficient enough. And so what the left has done, going all the way back to the 1930s with the emergence of the New Deal, is focus on not just institutional capture, as I would call it, but the capture of programs and institutions that lead to the halls of power. Credit to them. I mean, this is not, I think on the whole, is not illegal. It's not even unethical. They're just very good at understanding where the levers of power are. The right, certainly speaking for myself, We're latecomers to understanding the importance of those institutions outside Washington that are pathways into that power, right? It's self-evident to all of you who, among other areas of expertise, see these gaps like this and figure it out. But that's what's happening now on the right. And, the ironic thing about all the ink that's been spilled on Project 2025, Dwarkesh, is that what Heritage does more than anything, in addition to its great work on policy, is revitalizing American institutional life for the very reason that you identify, which is to close that human capital gap.
What do tech people least appreciate about how DC actually works?
Oh boy, you appreciate that it's dysfunctional, which is correct. You appreciate that there's something, by definition, therefore, broken about it. Actually, we'll say something that's genuinely hopeful. Because I can go on and on about the things that are bad, you know them. But one final point on that, it's worse than you think. But the hopeful thing, and I am an optimist at my core, the hopeful thing is, and I've been surprised by this since moving there from Austin 3 years ago, there are so many groups of good men and women in DC. Some of them elected officials, some of them in think tanks like Heritage. I would say all 340 of my colleagues are in that category, but I'm biased. But also other groups, a little bit on the periphery of the halls of power, some of them libertarian, some of them tech-oriented. And that gives me hope, not just because of their presence. By that I mean just walking on the sidewalks on Capitol Hill, encountering these people who you might disagree with on a few things, but they're asking the right questions, they're focused on sovereignty, they're focused on the American dream, which I mean like genuinely the American dream, not some trite thing. But most of all, they are doing this on their own initiative, which is a reminder to me and an encouragement to me that even in Washington, D.C., which I like to call the Imperial City, that there are still people who are wired toward freedom. And that, I think, we can revitalize a republic around.
How does the think tank world actually work for somebody who doesn't live in Washington? Do you meet the right people? Do you write the right documents? How do you want something to happen? How do you, Kevin, make it happen?
Well, Heritage is a distinctive, if not unique animal in that we not only do the white papers, but as I like to remind our staff, every word we write is oriented around policy change. Passing good policy, killing bad policy. And other think tanks have different models, which is fine. But how we operate at Heritage, to some extent, what's a typical day and week for us, very briefly, is every component of the policy-making process. The things that are obvious, the research and writing, the media, which our folks are particularly good at. You saw one of our best with Kara here. But what is perhaps not appreciated, because you'd have no reason to know this, is that Heritage's influence, to the extent that we have influence, doesn't just come from the smart people we have on the inside or the meetings we have with policymakers. It really comes from the several 100,000 people who are our donors, yes, but because the vast majority of them live outside DC and outside the halls of power on the East Coast, they remind us of the real problems facing, as I like to call them, everyday Americans. This is the point. That list of ingredients creates a recipe that makes us, at Heritage, even though we're literally a stone's throw from the Senate buildings on the Capitol, very independently minded from the elites in DC. And I think it's what makes our work special.
Final question. So you've been meeting tech folks, I guess this week. More generally, I assume you've probably been meeting a lot of tech folks, especially since given the vibe shift in the summer. When you go back to Washington, what is it that you feel your DC conservatives probably don't understand about tech? And don't just flatter them. What will you actually tell the DC friends about what's happening in tech?
Yeah, well, look, it's a more substantive answer than I would have been able to give 3 years ago. Because one of the great pleasures of my job is meeting great people, and I really do mean this, y'all are among them. What I will say is what I told you earlier. Point number one, man, I was wrong about understanding how some, maybe most of these technological innovations can benefit the Republic. And that number two, the people behind them are people who are kindred spirits with conservatives. They may not all, or even many, call yourselves conservatives or even libertarians. Maybe you don't even like labels. But the second thing I've learned profoundly, particularly in the last year, is how kindred we are in the key things we care about. We might have some serious disagreements, but that leads me to the third point. What I really like, just on a personal level, about every tech person I've met is y'all are willing to have a conversation. And so know that in DC, that's one of the problems, is that the elites try to put these parameters around the proper conversations. And what y'all say is, to hell with that. And I'll sign up for that every day. So thanks for being an encouraging force.
Awesome. That was a lot of fun, Kevin.
Thanks, Dwarkesh. Really appreciate it.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph Fonspakowski. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.